Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. A nice strong microphone. I welcome you here today. My name is Fairfax. I'm a proud graduate of Kellogg College from the Sustainable Development Program. We gathered this morning to discuss beauty and the ways and means by which it can be measured. This is a small, modest subject, really, just the sort of thing one might really neatly resolve in a panel discussion right before lunch. Is beauty really only in the eye of the beholder, or can it be constructed, measured, and replicated? In our presentation, Lightning Rounds, we will present 3 separate areas of research which examines the subject of the mechanics of beauty. We'll start with architectural neuroimmunology, a new course of study, and this is a paper by Cleo Valentine, one of my colleagues at Kellogg, who made this her dissertation study. When she told me what she was going to do, I told her she was a bit out of her mind, that you would never be able to measure architectural responses to physiological responses to beauty and to architecture. But she powered through, and now she's going on to her PhD at Cambridge, and then she's working at MIT, and she's really gaining a lot of ground. So we're going to start with neuroimmunology, which I'm having a hard time saying, a paper by Cleo Valentine. Cleo is a graduate, and she is, let's see. So then we have Nicholas Boyce-Smith, director of think tank Create Streets. His research work centers on improving the quality of the built environment through the use of data collection, such as visual preference surveys, as well as other methodologies. And lastly, we have Richard Sammons, architect, who will present practical construction techniques of architectural design through geometrical proportion. So I'm just going to get this out here. So architectural neuroimmunology, examining the impact of visual complexity in architectural facades on neurophysiological stress. So Cleo could not be with us today, so she gave me her paper to read, so I apologize for reading it, and I've now watched her present it in Boston. When she arrived, she had one of her front teeth was missing. I thought it was kind of ironic that she was presenting.
That's how good the presentation.
No, really, I know she went through with it, so I told her don't come because you'll shock the audience here. In our first paper on, so I'm speaking in her voice. In our first paper on bioethics, oh wait. Forgive me here. Today I'm going to speak about the field of architectural neuroimmunology, which is a term I use to describe the relationship between the built environment, the immune system, and the brain. Neuroimmunology is a relatively new discipline that examines the interplay between the nervous system and the immune system. Both of these play a critical role in mediating the body's interactions with the built environment. Specifically, the work I'm talking about today explores how the built environment may elicit neurophysiological stress responses and what that means for both public health and the architecture design profession more generally. And funnily enough, the work stemmed directly from my work here in Oxford, where I was looking at whether aesthetic inclination in the built environment impacted public health. What I found in my initial work is that in many ways it does, and is often mediated by organic geometry and form. That work is actually the project that I'm focused on at MIT now, and from this work, I started to wonder if neurophysiological stress might be the mediator in this interaction and how one might go about measuring it. Even though this is a very short talk, I always like to start with a quick review of some of the physiological processes I'm going to be chatting about today. This is a diagram from a recent paper of mine. In this diagram, we can see a very simplified map of a stress event. Stress here refers to any real or perceived threat to psychological or physiological well-being. So this means that a stressor can be a physically traumatic event like a car accident or something emotionally distressing or even disorienting. It's quite a broad term. In this model, acute or short-term stress triggers something called allostatic processes, which is more commonly referred to as the fight or flight response. This response aims to restore the body to a state of balance or equilibrium, also known as homeostasis, and it does this through neurophysiological changes that help us navigate or evade the stressor. While stress responses are very, effective in acute or short-term events, in fact, they are protective and necessary for survival. Chronic stress can actually lead to prolonged neuroendocrine responses, which have the potential to compromise the immune system, cause long-term damage to organs and tissues, including the brain. What the emerging research suggests is that the built environment, specifically certain types of architecture, can elicit these stress responses. But why do these patterns cause discomfort? One theory suggests our visual system evolved to efficiently process images commonly found in natural environments. Visual processing is more effective when images have spatial characteristics of organic forms. Natural images, although very diverse in their content, share statistical features such as the Fourier amplitude spectrum, facilitating efficient encoding by cortical neurons. However, departures from these natural image properties, many of which are now frequently encountered in contemporary urban settings, have the potential to induce visual discomfort. Unnatural image properties causing visual discomfort include high contrast visual patterns, strong luminance contrasts, and high degrees of flicker. The cortical excitation and associated visual stress from these unnatural image properties is thought to occur because humans, in fact, lack the ability to process spatial features which are rare in natural environments. There are a few different ways we can examine the impact of these patterns on neurophysiology. Mathematical analysis, evaluating spatial properties using Fourier analysis and assessing luminance, contrast, or chromatically in architectural images. User impact assessment, measuring task performance and preference using Likert scales and self-reported visual discomfort. And neuroimaging, recorded cortical responses, techniques like the MRI and INIRS. Not all high contrast patterns induce visual stress. Factors such as pattern size, spatial frequency, luminance contrast, and viewing distance play significant roles. This is part of what makes architecture so difficult to study. It is dynamically experienced. We designed a two-part study that uses these methodologies to examine the impact of visual patterns in architectural facades on both the visual cortex and the downstream stress responses. We hypothesize that architectural facades with highly regular, repetitive patterns result in inefficient cortical processing and increased physiological stress. Didn't know it was animated. Okay. In order to test the effects of the facade on the physiological response, we created a controlled stimuli. This work is funded in part by the Heatherwick Studios Humanize campaign. To do this, we used Midjourney, a generative AI tool, to design permutations and combinations of a single facade with varying degrees of spatial complexity, geometric form, and visual stress. These are some of the outputs of the computational analysis. The yellow, it identifies the areas which are potentially most visually stressful. Interestingly, you can see the trees also lit up. This is because it highlights both the features closest to organic geometries and furthest. And this is something that she is refining in another study to separate those differences. For this study, 20 participants' heart rate variability and neurological activity were assessed while they were exposed to projected images of the architectural facades for a total of 25 minutes. Heart rate variability, or HRV, is a key indicator of physiological stress response. It measures the variation time between heartbeats, with higher HRV indicating relaxation and adaptability, and lower HRV suggesting stress. INIRS uses infrared light to measure oxygenation levels in the brain, which reflects changes in metabolic activity. This indicates how much effort a specific brain region, such as the primary visual cortex, is exerting by combining INIRS and HRV. We get insights into both brain activity and overall physiological stress. This one I think has. outcome, and perhaps the most significant in Cleo's personal opinion from this research area, has been the growing evidence that design significantly impacts human health, more profoundly than previously understood. This realization arguably compels us to critically reflect on our role as stewards of the built environment, particularly regarding our ethical responsibilities. Recently, I've been attempting to engage with these questions more directly, and here are some QR codes, links, should you be interested. On the left, you'll see a short piece that Cleo has written in the British Medical Journal a few months ago, speaking about the built environment and human health. In our first paper on bioethics, my co-editor Heather Michaeltree and I explored these ideas further. Architects are very often under an ethical duty to do no harm, similar to the medical professionals. This is a fundamental principle in professional codes of conduct. For example, in the UK, we have the REBA Code of Conduct 14.1 and similar guidelines from other governing bodies in architecture. This means prioritizing safety, health, and well-being in design, minimizing risks, and promoting positive health outcomes. Defining what constitutes harm can be complex, involving intricate moral, ethical, and legal considerations. Built environment professionals often face challenging decisions, balancing the needs of various stakeholders. For instance, in a public housing project, is it more harmful to not provide enough housing or to build in ways that may negatively impact occupants' health? These are difficult questions without straightforward answers. And to wrap up, what I suppose all of this work is trying to outline is how the built environment may offer a unique opportunity for public health intervention. Particularly as the impacts of design and experience are experienced passively. Unlike other public health schemes, our environment affects us even when we are simply existing within it. Arguably, there's no neutral space. It always impacts us, either positively or negatively. Understanding the impact of architectural form on stress responses and neuroimmunology activity is, at least in Cleo's biased opinion, both a very exciting research endeavor and an ethical imperative. We're really hoping that this research continues. Thank you very much.
Marvellous, thank you very much indeed, Cleo/Anne. Now hang on, this is the moment of truth. Does this work? I don't need that. Hang on, we'll just do a short technical intermission, it's all under control. I will cover some of the same space, but with far, far fewer long words. That's still not working. What do I do? Sorry, I've never used PowerPoint before, clearly. Security alert. We have a security alert. Ladies and gentlemen, leave the building. Right. Well, the problem is my opening. I'll start taking. Would you? Well, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, I founded and now chair a social enterprise called Create Streets. About 12 years ago, I went mad. I'd previously been a banker earning actually quite decent money, and I took my income down by 98.5% in the first year to set up social enterprise in my dining room because I became obsessed by the subject, which I'm about to share with you for the next 2 hours. It is 2 hours. The doors are locked. You may not leave. There is, however, still a security alert. And so what we do is, at our core, we do research into the relationship between the built environment and outcomes for humans. Where people prosper, where people thrive, where people wish to go, where they're more likely to speak to their neighbours, where they're more likely to walk. Walking is good for you, I can exclusively reveal. Where they feel at home in the world. We do that at our core. Oh, that's brilliant, Marcus. Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Brilliant. So I hate microphones. So is that okay if I just talk? Thank you.
Speak up a bit.
Right, so you can't hear me, okay? Right, okay, now you will all hear me. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you like to go there? I knew you'd say that. That's half the point. Well, every building that you see there is less than 25 years old. It's the rebuilt Frauenkirche in Dresden, which was destroyed in March 1945. So this is not part of my talk, but it's 10 seconds as a distraction. The second greatest source of rebuilding funds for that was actually the British, and the crucifix at the top was designed by a British silversmith, Alan Smith, I think from memory his name is, whose father had been the lead bomb aimer in one of the Lancasters that destroyed Dresden. So sometimes history comes back to the right point, even if it takes a couple of generations to get there. So I'll talk about this. We then, in addition to the research that we do, we're very, very interested in how we provide enough homes in this country and how we let the public fall back in love with the future and regain confidence in the types of places that we create, and the new built environment that we create will make existing places better. At present, 2% of the British public, that's not a typo, 2% think that new buildings will make old places better. When I say that number to planners and architects, they go, yeah, bloody developers, thank God we're here. And then I tell them that 7% of the public, so I can see some of you straining around, that 7% of the public trust planners to get it right. So something is deeply, deeply wrong. We then advocate for walkable, gentle density in which people can feel at home. We do master planning, that's one of our designs in Devon, trying to fix the cul-de-sac. We also try and provoke public debate. Have any of you heard of a university called Cambridge? No. No, fine. I thought you might not have done it. It's in a flat part of the country over there. I went there, by the way. And we showed how you could double the size of Cambridge with walkable, contiguous, gentle density off the back of trams. Trams are easy to do in Cambridge because it is flat, joking apart. The fights we're having, or were having with Historic Homes England, to actually do that in a way that would be prosperity maximising, I don't bear repeating. We then try and bring that to life. We managed to make some changes and persuasive changes in the planning system to make planning more visual, more predictable and more realistic and more popular, using what are called design codes. And we like to think of ourselves, perhaps a bit pompously, as part of the emerging revolution across the world of more beautiful placemaking and daring to fall back in love with the concept that we need to design places that people actually like, in which they feel at home. This is an interesting man, Philippe Penzec, who's been mayor of a place called Plessis-Robinson, in the southwest of Paris for the last 30 years, and who's just gradually building the most astonishingly beautiful new urban extension that looks and feels like Paris. Architects hate it, ladies and gentlemen. The public love it. Population has tripled. The land values have tripled. The amount of social housing has remained absolutely identical, has gone up slightly. That building that you see on the left is 100% social housing. And now it's catching. I showed you Dresden. This is a new town that we're currently master planning in the Middle East. Actually, and I didn't discover this till we went there, it was one of the people who lives there, who visited Dresden and suddenly realised that the one-way ring road and housing estate and shopping mall that had desecrated his town in the 1970s didn't need to stay there eternally as a statement of physical science. So we're trying to put back the street pattern. We haven't managed to do any research though, because it's a little bit hard to do research. There's the shopping mall on the left. There's the only surviving bit of historic town on the right. Those two photographs are taken about 10 minutes apart on a weekday evening. Where do people want to go? This is what keeps coming up in our work. So we do workshops to design places. This is one of the very early ones, and we started asking the public what we call engaging wide, and that's really what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes. This is from a very early counter-proposal we made in West London. It's not under scientific conditions, I think it's probably fair to say, but this is what the people in the local market preferred. What the market was, what the developer was proposing on the left, and what a community group had worked up on, with our support, had worked up on the right. As I say, I think that probably wouldn't quite pass the non-North Korean sniff test as a piece of research. But some of the stuff we do now, I think, does. This is from a design code we've been working up in Cheshire. We're increasingly going to the people, going to market stalls, going to Christmas fairs, not expecting people to come to a planning meeting on a wet Tuesday evening, because most people don't come, and actually ask them, where would you like? What would you like? How would you like your town to grow? And we use, in Cambridge, they have a science department, and they work on things such as this, and we've got a mobile phone app that now allows us to crowdsource people's preferences, and so we get hundreds, often thousands of responses when we launch a project. This is one of the very first ones we did, and the trick with engaging with the public is to ask simple but meaningful questions. Not what colour should the door be, or do you like jam, how's your mum, but you ask, what type of place do you like? Where's your favourite place in this town? Where do you take your children? Where would you let go of your young child's hand? What's your least favourite place? How would you like to improve it? And if you make it short and simple and purposeful, and if people trust that you're going to do something with the responses, then you can get thousands of responses in a few days, as we do time after time. And we've evolved a methodology which Anne kindly highlighted, visual preference surveys, which I'm going to come back to. I'll give you one quick example. So this is a project which we're doing in Lichfield, which is in the Midlands, where a series of drop-in sessions using our online platform leads to a brief that solves a problem. The council had owned a bit of land equidistant between the historic city centre. Lichfield, I should tell you, is a lovely, in origin, medieval city, which now presents as Georgian, because it's got Georgian street pattern. And when we ask the people of Lichfield, what do you like? They say, we like Lichfield. That's why we choose to live here. And I don't blame them. It's a lovely, lovely town. This site, which the council owns, equidistant between the city centre and the train station, had been trapped. Because the people said, we don't want more development there. And if we do have, we must be sort of two-storey houses with 3 cars each. And the market and the planners said, well, that's a ridiculous use of a town centre site. The market and planners were right on that. So we just flipped it around and said, what's your favourite bit of Lichfield? We got a clear brief, and we used that to write a pattern book. And they used that, because that then didn't cause a political upset, because we're just extending, we're growing the middle of Lichfield. Halfway through the process, the Conservative-run council went to an overall control. The same leader, but a Labour deputy. We were a bit nervous, but the Labour deputy, quite wisely, saw that about 88% of people supported what we were doing, and surprisingly, because on the whole turkeys don't vote for Christmas, said, well, I'll keep supporting that. So we've actually managed to go through a near change of political control with no controversy. I was speaking to, this is the pattern book, some of the local architects hate it, but people are supporting it. I was speaking to the developer yesterday, he's absolutely delighted, because he knows that the next bit of the land, which we saw probably someone else and you can try and buy it, will have to develop to the same standard he is, and he's confident that the slightly higher build costs he's going to do are going to result in much higher sales values, and that obviously allows also for a high proportion of social housing. And this is on the drop-in sessions and some of the response to the plans as they emerge. So this is, I'll just go with that. So this gets to the serious point. Good design is not subjective. If you hear a planner or an architect telling you that design is subjective, they are either ignorant or mendacious. There is no other excuse. They're probably ignorant, to be fair. It is true that on an individual level, your individual response, sir, or yours, madam, or mine, or Anne's, is conditioned by factors that will be personal. Your personal experience, personal predilections, good or bad experiences. That is true. So we're not computers. We're not controlled by our environment. Give me one person and I cannot tell you what he or she will respond to a place. But give me 100 people and I can tell you how somewhere between 70 and 80 of them will respond most of the time. And it's not actually even that culturally preconditioned, though there are some kind of climatic conditions that will affect what works in what places. Just as an aside on that, imagine visiting a beautiful town in the south of Italy, or a beautiful historic town in China or in Vietnam. Do you like it? You probably do. And likewise, I used to work in China. When my former Chinese colleagues came to Cambridge to study there and then came and spent the weekend with my parents in Amity in Bedfordshire, a lovely English Georgian town, they loved it. You don't need to be from the place to appreciate it. Some of you may have heard of an interesting lady called Jane Jacobs, an American who did important work in the 1960s, arguing that replacing Manhattan with a series of freeways was probably a bad idea. She was attacked viciously, brutally, by the planning establishment, and her writings were described as the ravings of a mad coffee-stained woman, which I think probably is something we would not want to associate ourselves with. How a place works is not just how it looks. We talk about a virtuous circular place, which is a function of centripetal, not centrifugal growth, intensifying, enriching, a gentle density, with some of the advantages of personal space. Most of us want control over our own built environment and need it, need a garden, need a bit of personal space, but also there are advantages to propinquity, being able to walk to the shops, children being able to cycle to school, having the type of environment that can cope with a local pub. If you could create a place in which a local pub can work, you're probably creating a good place. And then re-stitching from Duplo urbanism to Lego urbanism, which is something we're working on time to time. So we try and summarise that in this leaflet, which I'm not going to go through now, which I stupidly forgot to bring with me. Things like block patterns, which are associated with clear block patterns with clear backs and fronts, in good Australian and slightly good, less good British research are associated with low crime. Greenery is good for you, nearly all the time, not quite always. Street trees, the metadata on street trees is incredibly strong. They are correlated with good outcomes in multiple ways, in multiple studies, in multiple countries. There's no absolute binary in urban design. The closest you probably get to is if in doubt, plant a street tree. Social interactions on streets. This is a famous study from 1977 on the west coast of the States, which has been replicated in Bristol a few years ago. These 3 streets are morphologically similar. That's a pompous way of saying that they're the same. One's heavily trafficked, one's moderately trafficked, one's lightly trafficked. Those lines are friendship patterns. Can you see what's going on? Right, I'll pass on there. Small front gardens of this size, about that size, about the distance between you and me, the two people wearing red trousers. If your front garden is about that size, yes, as opposed to bigger or smaller, you're more likely to speak to your neighbours. And again, think about it. This is everything I'm saying is an exercise in the bleeding of this. If you have too big a garden, you're going to be hidden away behind the bushes. If you've got no front garden, you're not going to be there. Small front garden, you're cutting your roses, and Joe or Jane walks past, and you can have a quick chat. You're on your ground, she's not on your ground, he's not on your ground, and it works sociologically. But having said that, it's not just what places look like. But what places look like does matter. Here are some themes that come out from the wider research, from our research, and from the work that we do on the ground. This was one of the very first visual preference surveys done by Robert Adam just exactly 20 years ago. When asked which they preferred, 77% of people went for options 2 and 3, and only 23% went for options 1 and 4. That's an incredibly, surprisingly consistent figure. You'll see in a moment. It keeps being normal. It's normally in the 70s that you can that people felt the same sort of thing. This was one of the very first studies done on how people felt in different places, done by an Israeli academic, Yoram Roth, done in the States. 66-point-something% of people's response to places was a function of where they were. The rest was probably a function of who they were. Walkable places, variety in a pattern, bit of greenery, not barren or faceless facades, were associated with most people, not everyone. So I can't predict 100% saying they preferred to be in the place. This was one of the very first visual preference surveys we did, best part of a decade ago, before we had access, as we do now, to online polling on us almost on tap basis. Was 87% of people preferred the 2 facades on the top, whereas only 13% preferred the 2 facades on the bottom. We were also able on this one, though it was self-reported, to ask people what their jobs did. Nearly half the people who preferred the 2 buildings on the two buildings on the bottom were planners or architects or designers. The 2 buildings on the bottom won 9 architectural prizes. The 2 buildings on the top won none. There was also an interesting work done by David Halpern, who used to run the Nudge unit until a few years ago, one of his very first studies actually, where he was looking at what is the consequence of the repeated exposure to images on our perceptions of them, and he found something he wasn't expecting, wasn't what he was looking for, because he was doing it on faces, he was doing it on buildings. He found that the faces' responses were quite contiguous. Everyone was essentially responding in fairly similar ways. People's response to buildings were bifurcating into 2 groups, Group A and Group B, which were literally almost opposed. So you had a look at Groups A and Group B. Group A were all which was a smaller group, were the architecture students. Group B was everyone else. And there's been a similar study which we were involved with in South America and another one in Canada. We call it the design disconnect, and it matters because as Andrew's touched on, architecture and design is the most public of all the art forms. It doesn't matter, madam, what music you listen to, it's immaterial to me, I wish you well in your music choice. However, if you own a house in the street next to me and knock it down, put up something I hate, that does actually affect me every day, and then indeed vice versa. So we then started doing, online initially, surveys of issues such as enclosure, and we started finding quite consistent responses. The street in the top right, enclosure ratios of about 1 to 2 came out consistently more popular. We also started working with academics such as Tanuki Sereniso, who's also worked with Clio actually, and she did a paper for Nature linking responses to places with mental health. So places in which more photographs are taken, this is based on over 1 million images, places in which more photos are taken, which more people find to judge to be scenic, are strongly correlated statistically with areas of higher mental health. We've got very good local data on mental health. There's causation and correlation going on there. I'm not arguing pure causation, because clearly people who've got more agency, more prosperity, are likely to choose to live in places which are just more attractive and safer and easier to walk in and easier to know your neighbours. Polling in the States correlates people saying they find their home attractive, their hometown attractive, with better outcomes, more strongly than other outcomes. So there's something going on here. I come back to my key point. Good design is not subjective. Don't believe people who tell you that it is. Do any of you prefer the building on the bottom? No. I thought you'd say that. When a friend of mine, Chris Montgomery, was doing survey on these two buildings in the same part of the same city, he got students to pretend to be lost tourists in front of both buildings. Lots of this research is done with students because, as Kellogg can tell you, students are cheap. And the students pretended to be lost tourists in front of these 2 buildings. 5 times as many random passers-by spontaneously offered to help them in front of the building on the top versus the building on the bottom. They're in the same neighbourhood. I can give you a coda, which is not in the publication on this, which is that one of the spuriously lost tourists subsequently ended up marrying the person who picked her up. Which all rules of social research and probably invalidates the research. But it is, can you guess which building he picked her up in front of? Yes, exactly. So colour improves mood. We know this now from a range of studies. Places that more, streets like this, similar ones in Paris or in London, tend to be the most photographed. Most of us prefer shapes, faces, buildings, which are either symmetrical or have embodied symmetries within them. So we're not saying it has to be pure Palladian portions, but most of us do just, and our brains, and this is something that Kellogg can talk about more clearly than I can, our brains can literally process symmetrical images more clearly than non-symmetrical images because your brain can make assumptions and jumps. It just makes an assumption the left-hand side is like the right-hand side and so on. And we see that, I've got 5 minutes or 5 seconds?
5 seconds.
5 seconds, oh, that's a shame.
Sorry.
Some facade complexity is good, but not too much. This is one of the early studies I've done on this, which has since been correlated. These now, I can just do 2 minutes. So we've now done a wide range of visual preference surveys. These are some of the early ones, and we just find it incredibly predictable. That's doing the same thing, it's just an arcade. You can see that nearly everyone, like one, prefers the one on the left. It's got that greater texture, that organic form, within essentially the same functionality. Likewise, we'll just jump over this. We do these visual preference surveys where we keep everything that we can the same other than the thing we're testing for. This is actually what we did commercially for a developer in East London, just close to the City of London. Nearly 80% of people would rather the street looks like that, with a gentle density, variety and a pattern on the right, versus the status quo on the left, likewise. This is one we did to annoy Marks and Spencers, who are going to destroy one of the last classical buildings built in this country, which is half the building on the right. The public would much prefer that you double the building added to it, rather than you replace it with spreadsheet architecture on the left. And here's a key fact, ladies and gentlemen. We think happens less than America, but we are faced with divisions. With a very, very strongly, sincerely, differently held views about the polity of this country, about immigration, about a whole range of issues. But ladies and gentlemen, and I really can't stress this enough, this is something we agree on. Labour voters, Conservative voters, Remain voters, Leave voters, high status, low status, every British region, those aged above 65, a little bit less clearly those aged below 24, all basically, not all, a high proportion, have the same view. And that just is repeated time after time after time. We've just, and I'll stop on this, this will be my last point. I was hoping to get to a case study on Toulouse, but sadly time has run away from me, I talk too much. We have, it's not yet published, but it is about to be published. I've been working with the summer as my sort of holiday project, my wife likes my holiday project, keeps me out of the way. Have been working with ChatGPT, feeding it a whole bunch of images, which we have already polled on, and asking it to use to judge them, let's just make sure I read it, on beauty, coherence, calmness, comfort, empathy, intimacy, reassurance, relaxation, visual pleasure, and well-being, based on the academic literature it can find. On this one, and all the others looked at, bar one, which was 9, 10 out of 10 are judging the image which polls more popular with the public. So the research, when you actually go and look at the papers, the visual preference surveys, when you ask the public, by the way, some of the surveys, some done by us, have been done in other countries, and if you like, the AI summary of the literature, are all saying the same thing, and it correlates them with health and with value as well, which is that place matters. And if you're just thinking, oh, this guy's going on, he doesn't got the evidence, this is that. I'm going to jump over this. This is some scoring. This was a study we did of London property values a few years ago. It then correlates with value. £8,795. If you do what's called a hedonic analysis of every single property sale in 2016, and Alessandro did so for me, you find everything else held equal, because you've got enough data points, that a new build property is associated, other things held equal, with £8,795 additional value versus an old property. However, if the one thing you can sort of change mathematically is that the property is the same, but it's in an area with an above average number of pre-1900 properties, or a high intersection density, that's a ratio, a measure of traditional street pattern, or with an above average proximity to a listed building, you're not getting 8,795, you're getting 58,000, 57,000, and 49,000. And you're getting similar correlations with index, or rather with negative correlation with index and multiple deprivation. And we can then use that to literally predict place quality. And there's a similar, in fact, even stronger study done in Holland, just in case you're thinking the British are just an outrageous reactionary. So I'm stopping there. The net is drawn. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
brings to mind is that he's able to do that because he actually has a vocabulary in which to do it with. The problem with most architects is they don't have a vocabulary. They're taught nearly nothing. They don't even know what they're supposed to be, conveying at that point. It's gotten to the point of such a reductivist, we don't even know. Architects don't even know the tools of their trade anymore. They don't even know the language they're supposed to, they can speak, or any of the languages they can speak. It is basically either gibberish or baby talk. And that's what you get. Now, even in the most, in the lovely ones we all like, as an architect, I look at them and I cringe at a lot of the faux pas and just illiterate uses of traditional detailing. Now, usually the architects don't like it because it's traditional. I usually don't like it because it isn't good traditional. I mean, it's not. Well, anyway, I should have some slides here somewhere. Thank you. I don't. Mechanics of Beauty is actually the name of a course I teach, and I taught the only course on architectural proportion at a university level that I haven't found another one, and so I get down to I don't understand why this isn't taught at first year, and I don't it's baby talk. I mean this is math course. I mean this is the most boring stuff that you're supposed to know before you get to architecture school, but we don't. Nobody seems to know it. Let's see, which is the forward. You're not depressed, you're surrounded by ugliness. That's kind of a universal ugliness, which when I was a young architect in my first job in Venice, I thought everybody had a view like this, and everybody had, it was just obvious. It was self-evident that this was attractive, and this is our goal to produce more of this. And even the most mundane buildings, such as this in the early part of the century, a commercial building, which from a distance you wouldn't think much of, as you get closer and closer, there's actually evidence of intention, evidence of care. And none of this is new. I mean, the thing is, every generation has to come up with a new vocabulary to excite people to understand that it's actually, when I listen to you, I hear Tristan Edwards from the early part of the 20th century. So we have a verity. The problem with ugliness is that it tends to lure us to the world. And of course the visual preference surveys between this and that are obvious. And then this has become, that there's actually a popular movement. There's this is in a, that we have, the BBC4 programs on beauty with Heatherwick. And here we have the underlying psychologist Alex Coburn, coherence, fascination, and hominess. Coherence and fascination are probably have something to do with the object itself, and the hominess is probably something we bring to it. And so when we talk about objective beauty, we're not talking about that this is a universal response to something. We're talking about the characteristics of the object itself. Where does the seat of beauty lie? Does it lie in our response to it, or does it lie in the characteristics of the object itself? In classical aesthetics has always said it's the object. The object, the characteristics of the object are what we're responding to. How we respond is personal. But in general, overall, we tend to respond very similar to things that are well proportioned, that have a unity, have certain colors that look good, things that are coherent, things that are pretty, all this lovely stuff. And but we tend to like things that we like better, as it were. So the familiarity. And of course, that brings us to the dual nature of beauty, which we, this. Christopher Wren, which is basically paraphrasing Thoreau, the two types of beauty, the natural and the customary. The natural is from the geometry consisting of its uniformity, that is quality, symmetry, proportion, rhythmy. And the customary is begotten by use or familiarity. And of course, we can go through Vitruvius and all this jazz. But let us talk about proportion itself. Now, one of the characteristics of the object are whether the parts of it respond to each other in any kind of way. And usually, when we talk about proportion, we're talking about when you proportion something, basically you are dividing it. And you're dividing it really in three phenomenological ways. One, which is right down the middle, quality. That is sameness, doesn't produce interest. Proportion doesn't produce interest, it uses coherence. And with the quality duality or symmetry, here's an example of a very symmetrical building, a sequence building, and this is the pattern that consistently repeating the same dimension will give you coherence without interest. But all things in nature, of course, have an edge. Everything that's an object has a center and an edge. And the edge is usually identifiable. It's not the same as the center. And this is the notion of punctuation. All things in nature come to every blade of grass comes to a point. It doesn't come to a point. We've assumed it's been cut, and therefore it's a fragment of the piece of grass. Punctuations in architecture, of course, the capital, the entablature, the base, and so forth. There's a third type of proportion of division which we can do, which is neither the center nor the edge, which is not the mean nor the extreme, but somewhere in between. That is differentiation. We use differentiation as a biological term. It's everything. My fingers are differentiated from each other. Everything in nature that is similar is not exactly the same. It is differentiated from each other, and everything is essentially evolved to an individual characteristic. And these are the three things, the three various things in if we just look at linear proportion. And of course we look at, say, this is Bronte's Tempietto, and we can now look here, we see the top dome and the drum at the top and the drum at the bottom are actually different sizes, or it wouldn't be. But they are also different sizes specifically, and everything about the thing as a repeating situation. And we keep looking, of course, it has nothing to do with classical architecture. We can here into Sammons Chapel. We can see punctuations, differentiations, and inequalities abound here, and they abound in a predictable way. You might think that it isn't, but it actually is very predictable. The visual preference survey here, which the Martian comes down from Mars. He looks at the two buildings and he's asked which one was built by the more advanced civilization. And of course. Now what I try to do is I try to teach students just quickly with a demonstration. So here's a nice Georgian room. If we go through the Georgian room, it has certain elements, and the first thing it has is a base. First thing you do is you give the thing a bottom, and the datum here, which is the order sit on, is arbitrarily given a certain height. Obviously, it's arbitrarily given a certain height right at my hip. And that's arbitrary, but the entablature is the exact same proportion, which is now not arbitrary. If you repeat it again and again, it becomes less arbitrary, and you begin to set an expectation. The expectation is rewarded in a way, and this is the coherence and fascination that we find in traditional work. To the point that even the smallest elements, which are punctuating elements, are the exact same proportion as the first punctuations we sent out, down to the smallest and smallest detail. This is the proportions of the smallest and the largest are exactly the same, repeat each other down. And we would say it's well proportioned, because if we suddenly came across something that wasn't that ratio, it would look wrong. And we look at the same room from the differentiation, the differentiation between where I've, decided to put a lintel across the opening, and that's arbitrary, but the height of the entablature to that is not. And the entablature itself is made of two elements, one which is, proud and ornament, and the other two are plum. In each case, onward and onward, the exact same ratio repeats and repeats and repeats. And again, this is horizontally, sideways. Now, qualities do exist, but qualities tend to be, the duality is created by equality, i.e. the hesitancy of black hierarchy can be solved in other ways or differentiated in other ways by character. Now, if we look at these elements of the room now, we can line them all up, and they're all follow the same rules. We can go through any building that is well done. It doesn't have to be, that was a modern building, this is Michelangelo. It's the same thing. Now, the classicists are always told that, it has something to do with the diameter of the column, and again, it has nothing to do with the diameter of the column, it's bearing and form. And you can, bearing and born is the thickness of the column to that which is carrying. So the entablature, which is part of the top, to the height of the to the thickness of the column, if you change the proportion of punctuation, you can actually, everything else changes as well. And it's a very mechanical thing. None of these are poorly proportioned, because proportion is relative after all. Here's a Georgian room, here's a neoclassical room. All we've changed is the proportion of punctuation. And, the fact that you can dial these back and forth, we try to get devices which allow us to do this, one of which is the proportional divider, which is an old tool. Here's one found at Herculaneum. This one's set to Golden Age. Now, quickly, again, geometric proportioning. We just looked at proportion in 2 dimensions. We can now look at it in 3 dimensions. We can look at it in 4 dimensions if you want to. Architecture is not a visual art, after all. And we can begin to think in terms of the diagonals of every rectangle has a specific diagonal. Any rectangle which has that diagonal is similar, a similar rectangle. And if we can think in terms of a continuum, this is the use of analogy, you can think of rectangles which are wider and wider in one direction and skinnier in the other direction. And again, it's a continuum, but we can every rectangle has within it its diagonal, its reciprocal, which is the perpendicular of that. And then there's a third one called the gnomon, which is the remainder. And so within every rectangle, there are 3 other rectangles. And so you can begin to identify nodes upon this uniform spectrum that now are constructive to each other, and it's exactly like the notion of musical interference. And we have a variety of geometric things, geometrical patterns which work that way, each producing their own sort of spectrum of notes on the page. Now, one way we can look at this is, just something we know about, which is our windows. There's something about the which way a window goes and how it's divided, which is quite interesting. The first thing is the sash window, which is, of course, the Dutch invention, which we've all adopted because of its universal, it's frankly the better system. The problem is that you have 2 equal sashes, you have a duality, and nothing is uglier than 2 blank window sashes. And if you start with one that is, say, 3 by 5 rectangle, that is the golden section, and one cuts it in half, which is the thing, you have 2 other rectangles in there, which are now called the new rectangle. you can have a play of the new rectangle and the golden section. Here's the new rectangle, exactly half a golden section, 2 new rectangles is a golden section. Funny that we wish to divide windows, and we prefer the 6/6 window on the golden section. Now, why do we prefer it? Because first of all, it confuses the fact that these are 2 competing elements, but the 2 competing elements, each sash itself is a mu rectangle, but when you divide it into 6 panes, each pane then is also a mu rectangle. And these repeat and reinforce each other. Yeah, so we'll actually divide windows, whether the windows are actually individual pieces of glass or not. Why would we do that? Well, we do it because it looks better. And then the other thing, in America anyway, people will add the persiane or the shutters, and even if they're just nailed on and functional, it looks better with the shutters than without the shutters. And why? It's because the shutters being double the size of the windows when they're open, they produce a mu rectangle, which, so it's a pattern of the, back to the original things, which was the equality. It's a half and half, or differentiation, or punctuation. And if the overlap of these things produces, and it doesn't matter what. So when we look at these windows, we see in this window, we see a repeat of the rectangles, which the whole window is, the half the window is, with the shutters and without the shutters. These are repeating ratios, and it gives a sense of coherence and orderliness. And we say orderliness in Kantian terms because it isn't law, it isn't lawfulness. It's lawfulness without law, lawfulness without law, and purpose without purpose. And we look at it, a simple facade like this, and we realize that everything in that facade is a repeating rectangle from the largest to the smallest, and that gives it the visual coherence. That's just training an architect to tune the building, basically. So this is all this is tuning. And it's as boring as that and as simple as that. It's very easy to do a decent looking building. You just have to tune the damn guitar correctly. If it's not tuned, it's not going to be successful. And so the mechanics of beauty has a lot to do with just tuning the instrument before you play it. So that's it.
Gosh, thank you so much for these presentations, and I'd like to open it up to questions, please.
Could I make a request that the slides for the second and the third talk are placed on a meeting of my website, because you whiz through it, and there's an awful lot of jolly good content in both of them. And I would appreciate that if they could please.
Absolutely.
Please,
As long as you're good with that.
It's £100 per slide.
Good value for civilization.
I totally agree.
And the question I want to ask is about teenagers. In Nottinghamshire, there are no youth clubs for out of hours because the local authorities are strapped for cash. And are you, when you design an environment, designing in places where teenagers can hang out cheaply and safely and not have knife crime and all the rest of the nonsense? Thank you.
I may be about to give you the answer you're not expecting or don't want. If you've designed a place which needs a specialist youth club, you've designed a bad place.
Exactly.
We did a bit of work recently. It was actually the most popular piece of work with the team we've ever done because it was paid for by the British Beer and Pubs Association. The entire team was basically trying to bribe me to go on that project. Little fools, I kept it to myself. No, I did start off the project. But if you create a place with a village green, a little high street, a town square, a place which naturally concentrates itself around a couple of nodes that are the ways you get from A to B, and which, by their physicality as well as their location, attract and entice, then you're creating a place that works as towns and cities have literally worked since the Happold civilization, 12,000 or 8,000 years ago, which is a place in which we wish to be for purpose, for work, for pleasure, whether we're 65 or 15. Some of the well-functioning towns in Spain still do that very well, actually, where the people come first, and the cars aren't banned, but cars are second-class citizens. So the honest answer to the question is no, we don't. Because what we actually try and do is create a place, we don't ever, with a very few exceptions, try and set the function of the building. Because, ladies and gentlemen, functions change in ways that we cannot know or predict. But if you create a place and buildings which are morphable and changeable and attractive and enticing, then we have confidence that people will come together naturally. I'm not saying there isn't a role for youth work and reach out, particularly in left behind places. Yes, there is. It's not our job. Our job is to create a place in which it is easier for others to do that, rather than trying to create a specialist youth club, which, based on my personal experience, and I was actually a session on community centres only on Tuesday, which thought that a community centre had to be something specialised, paid for by charity, as opposed to just an extra room on a coffee shop on a high street.
Nicholas, did you plant that question? Because you answered it so
No, I didn't. Thank you.
Yes, in the middle there.
Question for the second speaker. One of your slides you gave the reasons why people like trees and why they don't like trees. I'm going to have a chance to read the second column, so perhaps could you summarise what the reasons why some people object to trees in cities?
Some people do. There are functional reasons why people object to trees. Residents object to them if if the roots push up the pavements and makes it harder for them, particularly if they're need to wheel things. So that's something that sometimes goes wrong. There is concern if things fall from them. I'm pro trees, and I'm not making a case against trees. The main pragmatic problems are public officials. We're involved in several tree planting programmes. The most long-standing is in Grimsby. Actually, be careful what I say that I'm in Grimsby. In places other than Grimsby, highways officers, quite recently actually, I don't criticise them for this, they've got assets and liabilities, and they've only got so much cash to spend. So they see that, and they're right, that it costs more to manage a street with trees in than without. That is a fair statement. I don't blame them for thinking that. So what and tree officers, perversely, tend to also be opposed to putting trees in streets because it is cheaper, they're correct, to put a tree in a park rather than in a street. So they want to maximise the number of trees they plant. I don't blame them for that. We're interested in maximising human well-being. And we know that poorer areas have fewer trees than richer areas, and we know the data on the consequence for air quality, walking, sociability, traffic speed of street trees, particularly if you bring them out into the carriageway. So we always try and push the conversation and decision-making up to the chief executive or the leader of the council and show them the value uplift and the prosperity uplift from better greened areas, so they can make a legitimate decision that, yes, it does increase some costs in some part of the balance sheet of the council, which it does. However, the likely consequence in terms of tax receipts and local prosperity many times multiplies that on a factor of 6 to 8, depending on some economic analysis we've had done for one of our reports.
More questions?
But for Richard, not for me.
Sorry, it's for Nicholas again. A horrible doubt assails me. You claim, convincingly, that the reason why we prefer the beautiful old Georgian facade to the 2025 glass and steel horror is for structural, intrinsic, permanent, objective reasons. Could it not equally or partly be because of the inherent conservatism of the human species? And old stuff, by definition, hasn't killed us, and therefore we trust it more than new stuff, which for all we know might. And if you were to run those studies again in 100 years' time from now, wouldn't people be pointing at the 2025 glass and steel horror and saying, oh, that one definitely, as opposed to the 21-25 new horror?
Keen for Richard to come in on this. I'll do it very quickly. It's a very good question. I think it's a very fair question, actually. And you're partly right, actually. Leaving aside the inherent qualities of facade, which we talked about, it is true that buildings and places with which we are familiar, either directly or sort of by implication because we sort of recognise the pattern, tends to have emotive experience for us. And that's particularly strong if it's literally our home or our neighbourhood. So you can see in research on MRI scans, if we see an image, and I think about 80% of us, if we see an image of something that is personally meaningful to us, we get happier and respond to that more than you just see as a blank facade. So yes, but that's our nature. So I think my response would be, well, that is correct, that it's not at one level a deeply rational response. It sort of is actually, but I always get cross with developers and say, oh God, the NIMBYs are just being emotional. Yes, they're human. That's why they're being emotional. Deal with it. Do something they can be emotionally positive about. But so that's one. The second point. So I agree with your point there. Where I'd slightly disagree, at least the evidence would suggest it's not. It's incompletely correct. Is when we do, and I'm sorry, I'm done to show them, but when we do surveys, so modernism's 100 years old now. It's not new. What modernist architects do, well, I'm not anti-modernist, some modernists are very good, but what modernist architects do is they allow themselves to copy from the last century. What traditional architects do is allow themselves to copy from everything. Their life is easy. Francis Terry, who I briefly flashed up a picture of, he says it's so easy being a classical architect because I get to copy everything. These poor fools only get to copy the last 80 or 90 years. But when we do surveys on modernism, which is basically a century old, of the general public, not a bien passant, it doesn't score very well. We've had a century to get used to it, and we haven't. Whereas if you go back to the 50s or 60s or 70s, Victorian architecture, we don't have polling to be fair, but was coming back into public taste. So it is true that things tend to be a little unpopular when it's your parents' what did it. There's a bit of circularity in that. But we've now had long enough to fall back in love with modernism, and the population hasn't.
And I just,
So sorry.
yes. Well, I think you've been very unfair to the profession. I think what you talked about is a lot of stuff that we know, the new urbanist movement in America, these things have been current in the architectural profession for a long time. And also I think today architects are dealing, I'm also a graduate from the Sustainable Urban Design course, and today architects are dealing with the circular economy, we're dealing with energy efficiency, we're looking at fire safety, health and well-being, social issues, all these things, affordable housing. I think we are dealing with a lot more than you said. Do you think it's been unfair?
I think we've always dealt with that, and
Yeah.
the thing is that the problem with architecture is that we teach everything but architecture. As an architect, you'll be ill-equipped to solve any of those problems if you can't even solve a decent facade.
I agree with that.
Again, this is, architecture is we try to make it into the sort of social importance and of that which it actually is, but if you don't even know the tools of your own trade, you can't. If you don't know how to draw, how do you show somebody a picture? I mean, and then when it comes down to the last question, of course we like the Georgian facade because it's familiar. But that doesn't tell me why, I can show the Georgian facade to, but I can also show the Georgian facade to a Martian and he'll prefer it. It is based on a priori situation, which has nothing to do with our preferences. It has to do with mathematical agreement or not agreement. This is the way musical dissonance is either frequencies are constructive or deconstructive of each other. The same thing with proportion. So it's pattern of brickwork, everything. We like the Georgian facade because it was actually competently done. Now I can show you a lot of Georgian facades which are not competently done. They're done every day in new urbanist communities. They're horrible to an architect, but again, they're so much better than anything the profession typically puts out that we're happy to have it.
We're making a lot of assumptions about Martians there.
We have one in America. You're assuming that humans prefer rationality above everything. No, we're a sensual creature. And there's, just because somebody likes the Georgian facade doesn't make it bad. You know, good that they like it, make some more of it. When he makes things people like, they'll be happier.
Well, on that note, unless there's another compelling question, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much to our speakers. And I'd like to